Fake officers stormed the Mitchell property, threatening a child and assaulting his father, all under the false banner of HOA enforcement. They wore imitation badges, smashed fences, and targeted families too afraid to fight back. But waiting on the porch was Douglas Mitchell, a Desert Storm veteran with a steady aim and the law on his side. Just wait until you see how the standoff turned upside down, and why justice, in the end, came out swinging. James Mitchell knelt beside a pile of weathered metal and cracked wood, tightening the bolts on the base of an old windmill he had found in his late father's shed. It was a quiet Saturday, the kind that smelled like cut grass and sounded like distant birdsong. His son Tyler was crouched nearby, holding the instruction sheet upside down, pretending he knew what he was doing. 10-year-old Ryan, barefoot and curious, ran his fingers along one of the fan blades, eyes wide with wonder. This windmill wasn't just a project. It was a legacy, a connection to the roots of a family that had lived through hard winters, broken summers, and still stood tall. Behind them, the fence creaked faintly in the breeze, the world still soft in that quiet suburban hum, until it shattered in an instant. A blinding screech of tires cut through the air. James jerked up just in time to see a white SUV, no license plates, no decals, slam through their backyard fence with a crunch of splinters and steel. The windmill base toppled. Boards flew. Tyler yanked Ryan back just in time as three figures in black uniforms burst from the vehicle. Their boots hit the grass like thunderclaps. They weren't police. They weren't official HOA members. But they wore tactical vests, mirrored sunglasses, and the kind of swagger that only comes with entitlement. "You can't have structures over 6 feet," one barked, his voice slicing the air like a blade. Violation of HOA Code 12.19. James rose slowly, his jaw clenched tight. These weren't neighbors. They were strangers playing a game with real consequences. The tallest of the three strode toward the porch, lifted a heavy black baton, and with a theatrical swing, shattered the family's old wooden mailbox. Pieces scattered like leaves. James's fists balled at his sides. He took a half step forward before stopping himself. Ryan, his son, was behind him now, pressed to his back like a shadow. The boy didn't speak, didn't breathe. His small hands curled into James's shirt. From the front of the house, the screen door creaked. On the weather-beaten porch, leaning on the rail like a statue carved from war and years, stood Douglas Mitchell Menace 78, Desert Storm veteran, former wilderness guide. Half a lifetime spent in the mountains of Colorado, the other half watching society slowly forget the meaning of integrity. His sharp eyes scanned the chaos unfolding on his lawn, but his expression didn't change. No panic, no confusion, just a quiet, measured breath. And then, almost to himself, as if he'd been waiting decades for this exact moment, Douglas whispered one word, finally. He turned from the doorway with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make the world listen. Each step across the hardwood floor echoed with memory. The hallway was lined with faded photos, him in uniform, his late wife's laughter frozen in time, a younger James holding baby Ryan. But he didn't stop to look. Douglas opened the closet, not the one with winter coats or fishing rods. The other one, the one no one was allowed to touch. Inside, wrapped in cloth and memory, was his old hunting shotgun. Not a threat, a statement. He lifted it with practiced ease, checked the chamber, and stepped back onto the porch. Below him on the grass, chaos still ruled, but the wind shifted. The air felt heavier. Douglas didn't have to say a word. The sound of him cocking the weapon was louder than any siren. These so-called officers weren't part of any recognized homeowners association. They didn't have badges registered to a department or names in any local directory. What they had were imitation emblems stitched onto cheap uniforms and a playbook that relied more on fear than authority. Their vehicles bore no markings. Their paperwork, when they even bothered to show any, was nothing more than recycled forms with invented codes and vague threats. And yet, in neighborhoods like this one, quiet, middle class, filled with retirees and single parents, they operated freely. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They appeared like a storm, unannounced and overwhelming. First came the intimidation. citations that didn't exist, warnings about non-compliant trash bins or fences 1 inch too tall. If you questioned them, they doubled down. If you obeyed, they took more. And if you resisted, you disappeared from the conversation entirely. In the last 6 months, 2 families had vanished from the neighborhood. No moving trucks, no goodbye notes, just empty houses and locks that looked freshly changed. The neighbors whispered behind closed curtains, wondering if they'd said too much, if they were next. The local police had been called dozens of times. Every time, the reports were filed, and every time, nothing came of them. No arrests, no follow-up. We'll look into it, they'd say. These groups operate in a legal gray area. The HOA board itself denied involvement, claimed these were independent contractors acting without oversight. Yet somehow, they always knew who had reported them. At the center of it all was Karen Westfield, the self-appointed Neighborhood Standards Coordinator. She didn't hold an official HOA title, but her manicured finger was behind every complaint, her piercing voice in every threatening phone call. Her emerald green house at the end of the cul-de-sac was immaculate, her lawn a showcase of rigid conformity, and from her bay window she watched, noted, and reported. James's wife Sarah had stood up to them. It had started with a knock, harmless at first. She opened the door to a man in black standing just a little too close, voice just a little too loud. He told her they'd received multiple complaints about unauthorized decor in their yard, wind chimes, garden flags, things that had been there for years. She told him to leave. 2 days later, they returned. No paperwork this time, just shouting accusations. One of them took a picture through the window. Sarah, trembling but proud, had told them she was calling the police. By the time James got home, she was on the floor. The doctors called it a stroke. Stress-induced, sudden, irreversible. No charges were ever filed. Since then, James had done his best to keep things quiet. He trimmed the hedges exactly to regulation, kept receipts, installed cameras. But Douglas had never forgotten that day. He never forgave it either. Douglas Mitchell wasn't a man who dealt in theories or paperwork. He had spent too many years living where you either trusted your instincts or didn't make it through the season. He had served in places where silence was survival and precision was everything. What he saw now wasn't a surprise. It was a return. He had read the signs. The black SUVs slowly circling the block. The new faces walking dogs that didn't bark. HOA notices with sudden urgent language. They always came before the storm. So he prepared. Not with panic, but with purpose. He walked the property line every morning, checked the locks, oiled the hinges, mapped every camera angle and backup battery. And in the closet, far from curious eyes, he kept the one thing he trusted more than the law, a 12-gauge shotgun with a walnut stock and a history longer than the men who would soon come for him. Douglas didn't speak much anymore, but when he did, his words were chosen like rifle rounds. He didn't believe in passive justice. Not here. Not now. He believed in presence and resolve and the kind of silence that made lesser men uneasy. Because Douglas Mitchell knew something the rest of the neighborhood had forgotten. Sometimes justice doesn't knock. It waits. The so-called sergeant didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the threshold of the house like he owned it, his boots tracking dirt across polished wood floors that had seen 3 generations of family meals and bedtime stories. No warrant. No explanation. Just raw arrogance cloaked in a fake badge. His eyes swept the hallway like he was scanning for contraband. Really, he was searching for leverage. Something to use. Something to break. Outside, the second man grabbed James by the arm, twisting it behind his back. James struggled, half kneeling in the crushed grass, but the other man was built like a battering ram and moved with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this too many times before. "You're resisting," the man barked. "We can escalate. Your choice." James groaned but didn't give in. His face was inches from the ground, the scent of soil and spilled motor oil filling his nose. He clenched his jaw and forced himself not to look at Ryan. He didn't want his son to see fear, but Ryan was already caught. The third intruder had closed the distance with terrifying speed, grabbing the boy by the wrist. Ryan's eyes widened as he tried to yank away, but the man's grip only tightened. "The law's on our side, kid," the man said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You want to learn what real discipline looks like." The air snapped, not with wind, not with words. Click. It was the unmistakable sound of a shotgun chamber sliding into place, crisp and absolute, like a bell tolling in the silence of a church. All three men froze. Standing in the doorway was Douglas Mitchell. He held the shotgun with both hands, steady as stone, the barrel pointed straight ahead. His finger rested just beside the trigger guard. Calm. Patient. His stance was that of someone who'd been here before. Different time. Different terrain. Same predators. "Boys," Douglas said, his voice low and even, not raised but sharp enough to slice through the standoff like a blade. "I fought in a war where real discipline meant not flinching when your own reflection looked back at you." He took one step forward. The front porch creaked under his weight. Another step down onto the grass. The second man, the one pinning James, hesitated. His grip faltered just for a second, enough for James to pull his arm free and roll sideways, gasping. The first man inside the house turned slowly, hands lifting off his belt, his confidence draining from his face like water from a cracked bottle. And the third, the one holding Ryan, blinked hard, processing what that sound meant. He looked down at the boy, then up at Douglas, then down again. He released Ryan's wrist without a word. The bacon slipped from his belt and landed on the grass with a dull thud. Douglas didn't move. Didn't need to. His silence was louder than their shouting. His presence rewrote the balance of power. For a full 10 seconds, the world didn't spin. No one breathed. Time stood still around an old man, a boy, a fallen mailbox, and a windmill half buried in its own shadow. Because the message had been received, this house wasn't theirs. Not today. Not ever. Douglas didn't blink. He stood in the soft shadow of the porch, both hands steady on the shotgun, the barrel leveled with a calm so absolute it made the air feel colder. The three men, who just moments ago barked commands and threw their weight around, now stood frozen in awkward silence, unsure whether to speak, move, or vanish altogether. "You're trespassing," Douglas said, his voice even but dry as old timber. "Second Amendment. Private property. You boys might have missed that memo while printing your fake IDs." He took another step down the stairs. The grass bent under his boots with the deliberate crunch of someone who didn't rush, who never needed to. "I've got every notice from the real HOA for the last 5 years in a file cabinet, neatly dated and signed." He continued, "Not a single one with your names on it." There was a pause, not the kind filled with peace, but the kind that settles right before thunder cracks. The man on the left, a stocky one with a buzz cut and sunglasses too dark for the overcast sky, twitched. His hand drifted toward his belt, toward something hidden behind his vest. Douglas's eyes caught the movement. Without warning, he lifted the shotgun and fired a single round. It soared into the sky, loud and commanding, not aimed at flesh, but close enough to shake the marrow in every bone on the lawn. The echo rolled out across the neighborhood like a warning siren to anyone watching behind half-closed blinds. All three men dropped to a crouch on instinct, like dominoes knocked by sound alone. Dirt flew up around their knees as their hands shot up. The buzzcut man's eyes went wide. One of them gasped. The one who had grabbed Ryan whimpered, just loud enough for Douglas to hear. "Next one's for a kneecap if you flinch again," Douglas said coldly, his voice like wind across headstones. Slow, rough, absolute. Nobody moved. The man inside the house backed up inch by inch, palms raised and fingers trembling. His boots creaked on the old hardwood, sounding like confessions in a cathedral. Outside, the second intruder slowly dropped to both knees, placing his hands behind his head with exaggerated precision. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. And the third, now clearly the youngest of the bunch, swallowed hard and took 2 careful steps back from Ryan, as if the boy himself might be armed. Douglas didn't lower the shotgun, because this wasn't finished. He wanted them to hear the silence. He wanted them to sit with it. It was the kind of silence that didn't just hush words. It buried lies. It exposed men pretending to be something they were not. It made a mockery of uniforms bought online and threats rehearsed in front of mirrors. Douglas had worn a real uniform, had marched under real weight, had held a line where every inch mattered. And now, in his own front yard, facing 3 intruders dressed in costume, he held the line again. This wasn't theater. This was history. And Douglas Mitchell didn't negotiate with fakes. The tension snapped like a branch in the cold. One of the men, tall, pale, and suddenly trembling, broke the silence with a cracked voice that barely sounded human anymore. His hands were still raised, his breath sharp and shallow, and the sweat on his neck betrayed the fear he could no longer hide. We were just following orders," he shouted. "It's not what you think. We're part of a neighborhood discipline task force. That's all. Volunteers." Douglas didn't flinch. His gaze didn't soften. He'd heard lines like that before. Different language, different countries, same excuse. It was always easier to hide behind the idea of someone else's plan than to admit your own decisions led you to a stranger's front lawn with a fake badge and a fistful of threats. Before anyone could speak again, James wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Blood streaked across his chin, thick and red against the dirt smudged across his cheek. He staggered to his feet, knees shaky but unbroken. His eyes were fierce and unwavering, locked on the man who had shouted. "You picked the wrong street," James said, his voice gravelly and pained. "And the wrong family. There was no drama in it, no need to raise his voice." The words hit harder because they were true. He stood tall despite the bruise blooming along his temple, despite the blood on his shirt, not as a victim, but as a man who had reached his limit. Douglas moved like a clock winding down. Slow, deliberate, final. He gave one small nod toward the lawn. Face down. "All of you," he said. The men obeyed, not because they were told, but because something deep in them understood that disobedience would be a mistake they might not walk away from. They dropped to the grass one by one, the reality of their situation finally overtaking the illusion of control. Belts off. Now, Douglas added. Each man fumbled with his gear, removing heavy utility belts and laying them in a line. Metal clinked softly against the ground. Gloves, radios, flashlights. One even had a canister labeled compliance spray. All of it, props in a failed performance, lay scattered like broken masks. "Empty your pockets," Douglas ordered. They did, palms shaking as they pulled out wallets, keys, and laminated cards with printed logos. One had a folded flyer that read Neighborhood Action Unit in bold letters, but no legal seal, no HOA signature. It was theater, every part of it. Ryan stood nearby, holding his phone like a shield. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't even confused. His hands were steady now, the phone's camera focused on the scene in front of him. Red light blinking, recording, documenting, proving. Douglas glanced at the boy for a moment, then back to the men on the ground. "Keep filming," he said. Ryan nodded once, never breaking his stance, because this wasn't just about their family anymore. It wasn't just about a mailbox or a fence. It was about every neighbor who'd been intimidated into silence, every retiree who'd been told to obey, every empty house that had vanished without answers. Douglas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Justice, when real, doesn't shout. It simply shows up, and it remembers. The red and blue lights spilled over the lawn like a slow-moving tide. The distant hum of sirens had built for minutes, growing louder until it filled the silence left by the confrontation. And then, just 14 minutes after the chaos began, 2 marked cruisers turned onto the street and rolled to a stop in front of the Mitchell home. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Uniformed officers stepped out with hands resting calmly on their hips, surveying the scene not with panic, but with clarity. 3 men lay face down in the grass, their gear spread out in neat piles. A boy with a phone stood like a sentinel near the mailbox post. A middle-aged man with a bruised cheekbone leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed tight across his chest. And at the center of it all, seated calmly with a shotgun resting across his knees, was Douglas Mitchell. One of the officers paused as he approached. He removed his sunglasses, his brows pulling together as recognition lit up his face. "Douglas?" he asked, Surprised, but not entirely shocked, Douglas nodded once. The officer stepped closer, careful not because he feared danger, but because he knew better than to underestimate the man in front of him. His name tag read Ramirez. Officer Miguel Ramirez. Broad-shouldered, mid-40s, and carrying the same quiet intensity he'd learned as a kid growing up in this very town. "Are these the ones?" Ramirez asked, nodding toward the men in black sprawled on the lawn. He knelt down to inspect the ID badges, holding one up to the light. The laminate glistened, but up close, the lies unraveled fast. No registration numbers, no department logos, just stylized fonts and manufactured authority. "We've been after this crew for 6 months," Ramirez muttered, shaking his head. "Slippery, real slippery. Always gone by the time we get a call." "They weren't slippery today," Douglas said quietly. Ramirez looked up. "They came through the fence," Douglas added, "walked right into the trap." The officer stood and gave a low whistle. "Well," he said, "I guess they finally picked the wrong yard." A second cruiser pulled up. More officers stepped out, some starting to take statements, others snapping photos of the scene, documenting the evidence laid bare. Every detail was preserved: the footprints, the broken gate, the imitation credentials. James stood off to the side, a bandage wrapped tight around his split lip. He didn't say much, just watched, listened. His fists were still clenched, but not from fear. Not anymore. Ryan stood next to him, quiet but alert. His phone had stopped recording, but the glow of the screen still illuminated his face. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, not just fear, but pride. A sense that something big had happened, that something had shifted, and on the porch, Douglas Mitchell leaned back into his chair, the old wood creaking beneath him. He placed the shotgun across his lap, hands folded gently over the barrel. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The job was done. He watched as the officers cuffed the imposters, read them their rights, and loaded them into the squad cars. There was no struggle, no shouting, just the sound of metal clicking and gravel crunching beneath polished boots. Douglas exhaled slowly, as if releasing more than just air, as if letting go of something that had lived in his chest for far too long. The sun dipped a little lower behind the house. The wind picked up, rattling the half-assembled windmill that still stood at the edge of the yard. And Douglas, steady as ever, closed his eyes for a moment, let the breeze brush past him, and sank just a little deeper into his seat. The courtroom wasn't large. No grand columns or marble floors, just wood-paneled walls, a few rows of benches, and the kind of silence that carries weight. It had been weeks since the arrests, and the town, once quiet and disinterested, now leaned forward with eyes wide open, because what began as a backyard incident had unraveled something far deeper. Investigators discovered that the so-called Neighborhood Discipline Task Force wasn't sanctioned by any legitimate HOA organization. It was, in fact, a loosely connected group of former private security guards, most of whom had been dismissed from their past roles for excessive force, intimidation, and repeated violations of ethical conduct. The reports painted a pattern. These men had worked together at various properties before being removed, only to resurface under a new name, with new uniforms, preying on small communities under the guise of order and safety. It got worse. Emails leaked to the press showed that certain HOA officials, including Karen Westfield, were not only aware of these activities, they had encouraged them. The messages were vague enough to avoid legal implications but clear in intent. Do what needs to be done. We don't want troublemakers here. Make it uncomfortable for the ones who resist. And they did, for months, even years. At the trial, the defense attorney stood tall and loud, his suit crisp, his voice sharp with accusation. This was excessive, he boomed, pointing toward Douglas across the courtroom. A man his age, armed, confronting unarmed enforcement officers. There's a line, Your Honor. This wasn't defense. This was vengeance. This was overreach. Douglas sat still, not tense, not offended, just steady. He rose when asked to speak. The judge looked down over his glasses. The gallery leaned forward. Douglas glanced once toward James, whose jaw was still healing, then to Ryan, seated in the second row, hands clenched around the brim of his cap. Then he spoke. "I didn't go looking for them," he said. "I didn't chase them down. I didn't make threats, and I didn't act out of rage." He paused. "I acted because my grandson was grabbed, because my son was on the ground, and because my daughter-in-law, Sarah Mitchell, collapsed in our hallway after being screamed at by men wearing the same uniforms these ones wore. She never stood back up." The room held its breath. Douglas's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I didn't shoot them. I didn't hurt them. I stopped them. I did what the law says I can do, what any man would do when his family is threatened." He turned slightly toward the jury. "I protected my family. I protected my home. And if that's what you call excessive, then maybe you've never truly been threatened." The defense attorney started to speak again, but the judge raised a hand. Silence fell again. Then, from the back row of the gallery, a single clap broke the stillness. One man, gray hair, straight back, uniform hat in his lap. He rose slowly, brought his right hand to his temple in a sharp, deliberate salute. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe. Sometimes it walks into court on an old man's tired feet, speaks quietly, and leaves an echo that outlasts everything else. Justice, when it comes, rarely does so with fanfare. It doesn't always wear bright robes or arrive with applause. Sometimes it settles into place quietly, like a long-awaited breath that finally fills your lungs. That's how it came for the Mitchell family. All three impersonators were handed real sentences, not suspended, not negotiated away. They were charged with unlawful entry, threat to a minor, and assault. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. They had evidence, witness testimony, and a recording that left little room for debate. One captured by a 10-year-old boy who simply pressed record. What followed reached further than anyone expected. The local HOA board, until now a silent figure hiding behind bylaws and vague memos, was forced into the light. A full-scale internal investigation was launched, and within weeks, the neighborhood held a special vote. The old board was dissolved. Karen Westfield, found to have exchanged dozens of text messages with the enforcement team, was not only removed but faced civil charges of her own. A new chairperson was sworn in, one who promised transparency, one who met Douglas's eyes during the first meeting and didn't look away. James, no longer just a father and homeowner, filed a civil suit against the former HOA leadership for negligence and complicity. The paperwork was meticulous, not out of vengeance, but to make sure no other family endured what his had. The community stood behind him, signatures flooding the petition with surprising speed. And Ryan, he found his voice. At just 10 years old, he launched a podcast called Civic Shield. Each week, he and his dad unpacked what it means to understand your rights, to recognize real authority, to stand your ground with wisdom, not violence. The first episode was titled "The Day My Grandpa Said Enough." It trended locally, then statewide, then quietly it went national. But Douglas didn't care for microphones. His mornings were the same, just as they had always been. He'd wake early, brew a pot of coffee, black, strong, no sugar, and step out onto the porch. The wood beneath his chair still creaked, though now it was joined by the rhythmic sound of wind moving through a brand new fence. A fence rebuilt not just with lumber, but with the steady hands of neighbors who came by after the trial, unasked, and stayed until the work was done. Douglas would sip from his mug, the warmth of it curling through his fingers as he scanned the horizon. Not searching, just watching, observing the street he'd called home for 40 years. Sometimes a jogger would wave. A mailman would nod. Once, a little girl on a bike paused, looked up, and said softly, "Thank you." Douglas nodded back, but he didn't speak because the words he saved were only for the morning quiet, when the sun touched the porch railing and the shadows stretched long. He'd lean forward just slightly, eyes fixed on the edges of his property, where the lawn met the world, and in a voice not meant to carry, not meant for anyone but memory, he'd whisper, "Come again if you want." Then a pause. "I'm not going anywhere." The breeze would lift the curtain in the window beside him. The windmill, finally finished, would turn slowly near the garden, and Douglas Mitchell, a man who'd faced too many storms to fear the next one, would lean back in his chair, still steady, still watching.